Amara was only 8 years old, and she had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, ever since her mother, Naomi, had told her they would be flying from Chicago to Orlando for a much-anticipated family reunion. She had counted down the days with excitement. It would be her first time on an airplane, a thrilling adventure that she had imagined countless times. The thought of soaring above the clouds filled her with wonder. She had spent days dreaming about what it would feel like to lift off the ground, to see the world from above, and to be among the clouds that she had always imagined were made of cotton candy. On the morning of their flight, Amara dressed in her favorite outfit, a bright yellow dress that twirled beautifully whenever she spun around. She had chosen it especially for the trip, declaring it her lucky dress. Her small feet bounced with enthusiasm as she braided her thick curly hair into 2 neat plaits, just as her mother had taught her. In her arms, she clutched her most treasured companion, a stuffed giraffe named Tully. Tully had been her source of comfort since she was a toddler, its once vibrant spots now faded from years of love. She squeezed the stuffed animal close to her chest, feeling both excitement and nervousness flutter in her stomach. Naomi, Amara's mother, was a tall woman with warm brown eyes and a quiet strength that had carried her through many challenges. She worked tirelessly, balancing 2 jobs to provide for her daughter, yet she always found time to make memories with Amara. This trip was especially important to her, as they were traveling to celebrate her cousin Simone's grand accomplishment, opening her very own bakery. Naomi hadn't seen Simone in years, and she was eager to reunite with family, to share laughter and stories, and to let Amara experience the joy of being surrounded by relatives who adored her. Despite her excitement, Naomi couldn't ignore the small weight of anxiety pressing at the back of her mind. It had been nearly a decade since she last boarded a plane. Traveling alone with a child added an extra layer of responsibility, but she reminded herself to stay composed. She needed to be strong for Amara, to show her that there was nothing to fear. Her mother's words echoed in her mind: stand tall no matter the situation, carry yourself with grace, and never let the world make you small. It was advice Naomi lived by, and today would be no exception. The airport was bustling with energy, a symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the steady hum of flight announcements. Amara's wide eyes darted around, taking in every detail. She marveled at the giant windows overlooking the tarmac, the sight of massive airplanes preparing for departure mesmerizing her. She held tightly onto Naomi's hand, tugging gently every now and then to ask questions. "Mommy, how do the planes fly if they're so big?" she whispered in awe, gazing up at a towering jet just outside the window. Naomi chuckled, bending down slightly to meet her daughter's curious gaze. "They have powerful engines that push them up into the sky," she explained. "It's called lift. The wings help keep them steady so we can fly smoothly." Amara nodded seriously, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood. Still, she trusted her mother's words, and she imagined herself gliding through the air, just like the birds she often watched from her bedroom window. When it was finally time to board, Amara practically skipped down the jet bridge, her little fingers gripping Tully tightly. As they stepped onto the plane, she beamed at the flight attendants, waving enthusiastically. She had always been friendly, eager to make connections with the people around her. Her joy was infectious, and a few passengers smiled at her as they made their way to their seats. Their seats were by the window, just as Naomi had requested, knowing how much Amara wanted to see the world from above. As they settled in, Amara bounced slightly in her seat, peering out eagerly. "Mommy, do you think we'll see birds flying next to us?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent wonder. Naomi chuckled, buckling her seatbelt. "Maybe from far away, but planes fly much higher than birds do," she explained. Amara considered this for a moment before nodding, her mind racing with images of soaring through the sky, looking down at tiny cars and houses that would soon shrink beneath them. As more passengers filed in, a man with a confident yet approachable presence walked down the aisle. He was of medium build, with short, neatly trimmed black hair and a quiet intensity in his eyes. His name was Ethan Rivera, an off-duty FBI agent traveling to Florida for a much-needed vacation with his sister. Years of law enforcement had trained him to always be aware of his surroundings, even when off-duty. As he made his way to his seat, his gaze briefly met Amara's. She grinned at him without hesitation, a pure and open expression of friendliness. Ethan smiled back, nodding in acknowledgement. Something about her innocence and enthusiasm reminded him of his niece, and in that fleeting moment, he felt an unspoken sense of protectiveness over the little girl. He took his seat a few rows behind Naomi and Amara, close enough to be within earshot of any commotion. As the final passengers boarded, a flight attendant named Meredith made her way through the cabin. She was tall and slender, with blonde hair pinned neatly into a bun and sharp blue eyes that constantly surveyed the passengers. At first glance, she appeared professional, But there was something in her demeanor, a stiffness, a certain detachment, that set her apart from her colleagues. When she reached Amara's row, there was a noticeable hesitation in her movements. Her eyes flickered over Amara's bright, smiling face, and for the briefest moment, an unreadable expression crossed her features. Then, just as quickly, she forced a tight smile that vanished almost immediately. Naomi, unaware of Meredith's fleeting reaction, simply assumed the flight attendant was in a hurry. She thanked her politely and helped Amara adjust in her seat. The little girl hummed softly to herself, hugging Tully close as the plane prepared for takeoff. Ethan, however, noticed the way Meredith's gaze lingered for just a moment too long before she moved on. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her expression unsettled him. Years of training told him to trust his instincts, and right now they whispered that something wasn't quite right. As the plane taxied down the runway, Amara clutched Naomi's arm, her small fingers squeezing gently. "Mommy, I feel butterflies in my tummy," she whispered. Naomi smiled, brushing a comforting hand over her daughter's braids. "That's just excitement," she assured her. "Just take deep breaths, we're about to fly." Amara nodded, taking a deep breath as the plane began to ascend. The ground below them grew smaller, and soon they were surrounded by an endless expanse of sky. A look of pure awe spread across Amara's face. For now, it was a moment of magic, but neither she nor Naomi had any idea that this flight would soon take an unexpected turn. One that would challenge their strength, shake their sense of safety, and introduce them to a hero who would change their lives forever. As Amara pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the buildings below shrink into tiny specks, Naomi took a deep breath, relieved that the takeoff had gone smoothly. She had been worried that Amara might be nervous, but the little girl was enchanted by the view, her wide eyes filled with wonder. A few rows ahead, Flight Attendant Meredith made her way through the aisle, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she performed last-minute safety checks. She had been working for this airline for nearly 15 years, earning a reputation among her colleagues as strict but efficient. Though she prided herself on professionalism, there were moments, subtle but telling, when a different side of her emerged. A side she carefully concealed behind a crisp uniform and a forced smile. From the moment Meredith had seen Amara board the plane, something in her chest had tightened. The girl's bright yellow dress, her bouncing excitement, and her carefree grin had ignited a feeling Meredith refused to acknowledge. She told herself it was just another flight, another child full of too much energy, but deep down, resentment simmered beneath her carefully composed exterior. She had grown up in a household where certain beliefs were unspoken but ever present. Over the years, she had learned how to keep those thoughts hidden, especially in a professional environment. Yet no matter how hard she tried to suppress them, they had a way of surfacing, through a glance, a tightened jaw, a clipped tone. And today, that irritation had found a target. As she walked down the aisle, Meredith stole another glance at Amara. The girl was still beaming, her small fingers tapping excitedly on the armrest as she whispered questions to her mother. Naomi, ever patient, responded with quiet amusement, brushing her daughter's braids affectionately. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. She reached their row, stopping briefly to inspect the overhead bins. Amara, ever friendly, looked up at her with bright eyes and offered a small wave. "Hi," Amara chirped, her voice full of warmth. Meredith hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Seatbelt fastened?" she asked flatly, barely glancing at the girl before moving on. Amara nodded quickly, not noticing the coldness in the flight attendant's voice. But Naomi did. She had seen that kind of response before, the kind where politeness was offered only out of obligation, not sincerity. Still, she chose to ignore it, unwilling to let an unfriendly flight attendant dampen the joy of the trip. Ethan Rivera, the off-duty FBI agent seated a few rows behind them, noticed it too. He had spent years training his instincts to pick up on subtle cues, on body language that spoke louder than words. The way Meredith's expression stiffened when she looked at Amara, the absence of the warm, practiced tone she used with other passengers. These were small things, but they told a story. Ethan wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about the interaction put him on edge. He shifted slightly in his seat, making a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Meredith continued down the aisle, stopping to chat briefly with a young couple who looked polished and well-dressed. Her demeanor softened noticeably, her posture more relaxed. She exchanged pleasantries, even laughing lightly at something the man said. Then, just as smoothly, she moved on, her expression returning to its usual neutrality. By the time she reached the front of the cabin, Meredith let out a slow breath. She had almost convinced herself that her irritation was just fatigue, that she was reading too much into her own emotions. But when she turned to glance back at Amara's row, the flicker of annoyance returned. Why did the sight of that little girl bother her so much? She told herself it was because children were unpredictable, noisy, but deep down, she knew better. It wasn't about the child's behavior. It was about something else entirely, something she would never admit, even to herself. Minutes later, Meredith began the beverage service. She pushed the cart down the aisle with practiced efficiency, offering drinks in a clipped but controlled manner. When she reached Naomi and Amara's row, Naomi smiled politely. "Could I have a water, please, and some apple juice for my daughter?" Amara, eager to show good manners, added, "Please and thank you." Meredith's eyes flickered over the little girl's face. For a moment, something unreadable passed through her expression. Then, without a word, she poured the apple juice and slammed the plastic cup onto the tray with just a little too much force. The liquid wobbled, nearly spilling over. Naomi's brows furrowed slightly, but she kept her voice even. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured. Meredith gave a curt nod and pushed the cart forward without another glance. From a few rows behind, Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had seen the way Meredith placed the cup down, just a little too hard, with just a little too much deliberate carelessness. It was a small thing, but in his line of work, small things often pointed to bigger patterns. Amara, oblivious to the tension, took a careful sip of her juice, too busy watching the clouds outside to notice the unspoken exchange between the adults. Naomi, however, felt a quiet unease settle in her chest. She wasn't the type to assume the worst about people, but she had spent enough time navigating the world to recognize when someone's politeness was just a mask. She let out a slow breath and turned her attention back to her daughter. "Do you want to do some coloring?" she asked, pulling out a small notebook and a pack of crayons from her bag. Amara's face lit up instantly. "Yes!" As she eagerly flipped to a blank page, she picked up a yellow crayon and began to draw. Her small fingers moved quickly, sketching out what looked like two giraffes dancing in the clouds. Meanwhile, Meredith stood at the front of the cabin, gripping the beverage cart just a little too tightly. She didn't understand why Amara's presence unsettled her, but with each passing moment, that irritation simmered, threatening to boil over. And before this flight was over, that resentment would find an outlet. Ethan, watching everything with quiet vigilance, had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the last uncomfortable moment between Meredith and the little girl in the yellow dress. And he was right. Ethan Rivera settled into his seat, stretching his legs slightly and adjusting his armrest. His plan for this flight had been simple: relax, maybe catch up on some reading, and enjoy the few hours of quiet before reuniting with his sister in Florida. But as a trained FBI agent, relaxation never came easy. His instincts, sharpened over years of fieldwork, were always in play. He had learned to observe without staring, to listen without seeming to eavesdrop, and to pick up on the smallest of details that most people overlooked. And right now, those instincts were telling him that something was off. From his seat a few rows behind Naomi and Amara, Ethan had already noted the unsettling behavior of flight attendant Meredith. At first glance, she seemed like any other professional airline worker, efficient, poised, and controlled. But there was a rigidity in her movements that struck him as unnatural. She performed her duties well enough, but there was an edge to her interactions, a barely masked undercurrent of disdain whenever she looked at Amara. Ethan had seen this kind of thing before. Prejudice wasn't always loud. It didn't always show itself through words or outright aggression. Sometimes it was in the subtle ways people distanced themselves, in the sharpness of their tone, or the deliberate lack of warmth in their gestures. And that's what he had seen when Meredith interacted with Naomi and Amara, the way she had barely acknowledged the child's cheerful greeting, the way she had slammed the apple juice onto the tray with unnecessary force, the way she had offered polite small talk to the well-dressed couple ahead of them but turned cold and mechanical when speaking to Naomi. Ethan wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but he believed in patterns, and right now, he was seeing one form right in front of him. He leaned back in his seat, adjusting his posture so he could keep the flight attendant in his peripheral vision. He wasn't looking for trouble, just staying aware. That was his job, even off duty. Meanwhile, Naomi was doing her best to ignore the gnawing discomfort that had settled in her chest. She wasn't a stranger to this kind of treatment. It wasn't always obvious, and it wasn't always immediate. But she could recognize when someone had already decided what they thought of her and her daughter before a single word was spoken. But she wasn't going to let it ruin their trip. She focused on Amara, who was now deeply immersed in her drawing. Her tiny hands moved quickly, sketching out a scene of two giraffes soaring above fluffy clouds, their long necks stretching toward the sun. The sight made Naomi smile. "Are they flying?" she asked. Amara nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, they're up in the sky like us." Naomi chuckled. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." A few seats away, Ethan observed the small exchange, his gaze flickering between the mother and daughter and the flight attendant moving down the aisle. His mind ran through different scenarios, whether this was just minor rudeness or something that could escalate further. The years had taught him that prejudice, when left unchecked, could grow into something worse. He had seen it in cases he had worked on, in hate crimes that had started with nothing more than small, dismissive gestures. He had learned the hard way that ignoring the warning signs often meant arriving too late when things spiraled out of control. And that was why he kept watching. Meredith passed by again, her expression neutral, but Ethan caught the way her eyes darted toward Amara's row. There it was again, something lurking beneath the surface. He noted the subtle stiffness in her jaw, the way she pressed her lips into a thin line before quickly looking away. Ethan had spent years profiling people, studying their mannerisms, learning what made them tick, and he could tell that whatever was festering inside Meredith wasn't just standard work stress. He decided to test something. As Meredith walked past him, Ethan casually straightened in his seat and caught her eye. "Excuse me, miss," he said, keeping his voice polite. "Could I get a cup of coffee?" Meredith turned toward him, and just like that, her demeanor changed. Her expression softened into a professional, almost pleasant smile. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone noticeably more courteous than it had been when speaking to Naomi. Ethan nodded in thanks, but as she moved to prepare his drink, his mind was already working. That reaction confirmed it. Meredith could be polite. She could be accommodating, but she chose not to be when it came to certain people. He exhaled slowly, feeling a tightness in his chest that only appeared when he sensed something bad on the horizon. He didn't want to assume the worst, but he had learned to trust his gut, and his gut was telling him that Meredith's hostility toward Amara wasn't just a one-time thing. As he sipped his coffee, he made a silent decision. He would keep watching, because something told him that before this flight was over, he might have to step in. Naomi kept her focus on Amara, determined not to let a rude flight attendant spoil their trip. Amara was still happily sketching, her small hands moving in steady strokes as she added a bright yellow sun to the sky above her flying giraffes. Naomi brushed her daughter's braids gently, grounding herself in the warmth of the moment. But Ethan Rivera was still watching. The FBI agent had spent years honing his ability to detect subtle hostility, and what he was witnessing now wasn't just impatience or a bad day, it was something deeper, something calculated. Meredith moved through the aisle with stiff efficiency, her posture straight, her expressions controlled. To most, she appeared as just another busy flight attendant tending to passengers, but Ethan knew better. He had seen how she stiffened near Amara's row, how her tone cooled when speaking to Naomi, how the warmth in her voice reappeared when assisting other passengers. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. A few seats away, Naomi subtly exhaled as Meredith passed again. She felt the coldness in every interaction, the way Meredith avoided eye contact, the clipped responses, the small, unnecessary inconveniences. Still, Naomi remained calm. This wasn't the first time she had encountered someone like Meredith. She had spent years learning when to let things go, when to pick her battles. This was just another moment where she had to be the bigger person, where she had to set an example for Amara. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. A short while later, Meredith began collecting trash from the passengers. She moved methodically down the aisle, barely acknowledging those who handed her their cups and wrappers. When she reached Amara's row, the little girl was still deeply immersed in her drawing, unaware that Meredith was standing there. Naomi noticed and gently nudged her daughter. "Sweetheart, pass your cup to the flight attendant." Amara quickly looked up, reaching for the empty cup on her tray. With her tiny fingers, she extended it toward Meredith, her bright eyes filled with innocence. Meredith took the cup, but not with the same practiced ease she had with the other passengers. Instead, she snatched it from Amara's grasp with an unnecessary force, jerking it away as if the very touch of the child's hand offended her. Naomi's lips pressed together. Ethan, watching from a few rows back, clenched his jaw. The interaction was over in seconds, but the message had been clear. Meredith turned without a word, continuing down the aisle, her back rigid. Amara blinked, slightly confused, but quickly returned to her drawing. She was young, but she could sense when someone didn't like her. She didn't understand why, but something about the flight attendant's coldness made her feel small. Naomi saw the slight shift in her daughter's posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way she hesitated before picking up her crayon again. And that was what hurt the most. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. She reached out and smoothed Amara's hair again, a silent reassurance that everything was okay, that she was okay. But Ethan had seen enough. He had encountered people like Meredith before, people who let their biases seep into their actions, who wore politeness like a mask. slipping only when they thought no one was paying attention. But he was paying attention, and he wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. For now, he kept his seat, choosing to observe. But if Meredith escalated further, if she crossed a line, he wouldn't hesitate to intervene, because he had seen where unchecked prejudice could lead, and he refused to sit by and watch it happen again. Amara remained focused on her drawing, though her usual excitement had dimmed ever so slightly. Naomi noticed the change, the way her daughter held her crayon a little tighter, the way she bit her lip in quiet concentration. Small things, but they meant something. Ethan Rivera, seated just a few rows back, noticed too. The flight had been uneventful for most passengers, but Ethan's instincts told him otherwise. The interactions between Meredith and Naomi's row were brief, but each moment had built on the last, slowly intensifying. And if there was one thing he had learned in his years in law enforcement, it was that hostility, especially the kind that festered in silence, rarely disappeared on its own. It escalated. Meredith had continued her duties, but something about her movements had become sharper, more rigid. She wasn't just rushing, she was avoiding. Every time she passed Amara's row, her gaze flickered toward the little girl, a flash of something unreadable in her cold blue eyes. Naomi, determined to keep the flight pleasant for Amara, decided to distract her daughter with conversation. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "tell me about your giraffes. What are their names?" Amara perked up, momentarily forgetting the odd tension. She tapped the two giraffes she had drawn on her paper. "This one is Sunny," she said, pointing to the bigger one. "And this one is Breezy." Naomi smiled. "I love those names. Are they flying through the sky together?" Amara nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, they're best friends. They go on adventures and visit new places." Naomi chuckled. "Just like us on this trip?" Amara grinned. "Exactly." For a moment, the tension melted away, replaced by the warmth of a mother and daughter sharing a small, joyful moment. But a few feet away, Meredith clenched her jaw. That laughter, that joy. It was like nails on a chalkboard to her. She didn't even understand why it irritated her so much, but it did. She had spent her entire career keeping her personal biases hidden, burying them under a thin veneer of professionalism. But this little girl, this cheerful, bright-eyed child in her sunny yellow dress, was getting under her skin. Meredith tried to tell herself she was being ridiculous, that it was just a long day, that she was letting her exhaustion get the best of her. But the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. She tightened her grip on the beverage cart as she moved through the cabin, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Then, just as she passed Amara's row again, the little girl giggled at something her mother had whispered. It was an innocent, sweet sound, a child's pure happiness. But for Meredith, it was the final straw. She turned sharply, her voice suddenly cutting through the air. "Please keep it down," she snapped, her tone far harsher than necessary. Amara's laughter died instantly. Naomi looked up, startled. Ethan sat up straighter in his seat. The entire section around them seemed to pause for a brief moment. Amara, blinking in confusion, immediately quieted. She wasn't being loud, not any more than the other passengers chatting around her. Naomi's lips parted as if to say something, but she stopped herself. Instead, she placed a protective hand on her daughter's back. "I'm sorry," she said evenly, though there was a controlled tightness in her voice. Meredith didn't respond. She turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than it should have. Amara looked up at her mother. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered. Naomi's heart clenched. "No, baby," she said softly, brushing a hand over her daughter's braids. "You didn't do anything wrong." Amara nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes now. She didn't understand why the flight attendant had been so upset. Ethan exhaled slowly. This wasn't just impatience. This was something uglier, and he had a feeling it wasn't over yet. Naomi held Amara close, smoothing her daughter's braids as she whispered soft reassurances. But inside, anger simmered. She had spent years brushing off subtle slights, ignoring the cold glances, the microaggressions dressed up as professionalism. But this was different. This was targeted. Meredith's sharp tone had cut through Amara's joy like a knife, leaving behind only confusion and the sting of being singled out. The little girl, once brimming with excitement, now sat quietly, her small hands clutching her crayon with uncertainty. From a few rows back, Ethan Rivera had seen enough. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was analyzing, reading the situation with the precision of someone who had spent years deconstructing human behavior. Meredith's hostility wasn't random. It wasn't just about having a bad day. It was calculated, deliberate, and it was getting worse. Ethan had seen it before. He had worked cases where prejudice started small, a dismissive glance, an unnecessary rule enforced more strictly for some than others. But when left unchecked, it could escalate into something dangerous. and his gut was telling him that Meredith wasn't done. The turbulence began as a light shake, a gentle rocking of the aircraft. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring passengers that it was normal, that they should remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. Naomi reached for Amara's hand. "It's okay, sweetheart, just hold on tight." Amara gulped, her little fingers curling into her mother's palm. "Is the plane okay?" she whispered. Naomi smiled reassuringly. "Yes, baby. The pilot knows what he's doing." Meredith reappeared, walking briskly down the aisle under the guise of checking seatbelts. But when she stopped at Amara's row, her gaze was colder than before. She looked down at the child's trembling hands, her lip curling in disdain. "Stop making a fuss," she snapped, her voice low but sharp. Naomi's head whipped up, her eyes narrowing. "She's just a little scared," she said evenly, her voice holding back the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Meredith scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Turbulence happens on every flight. She needs to calm down." Amara shrank back in her seat, pressing closer to Naomi, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Ethan's fists clenched beneath his tray table. The hostility in Meredith's voice wasn't just dismissive, it was cruel. She had gone beyond rudeness. Now she was actively trying to intimidate the child. Ethan had seen hardened criminals try to justify their behavior in interrogation rooms, had listened to people excuse their actions as misunderstood or taken out of context. But there was no mistaking what was happening here. This was someone who had allowed hatred to fester inside of them, and now it was spilling out in the form of deliberate, targeted cruelty. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Meredith turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff, her hands clenched into fists. Naomi exhaled slowly, trying to keep herself steady for Amara's sake. She glanced back at Ethan, their eyes meeting for the first time. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that he was an FBI agent. But in that moment, she saw something in his expression, something firm, something watchful. He gave the smallest of nods, and she knew. She wasn't alone in seeing what was happening. Minutes passed, the turbulence fading into a gentle hum. The tension, however, remained thick in the air. Naomi turned back to Amara, who was now tracing slow circles on the armrest, her face unusually serious. "Are you okay, baby?" Naomi asked gently. Amara hesitated. Then, in the smallest of voices, she asked, "Why doesn't she like me?" Naomi's heart ached. She had spent so much of her life preparing for moments like this, for the day when her daughter would realize that not everyone in the world would be kind to her, that some people would look at her and decide, without knowing her, that she was less. She had always known the day would come. She just hadn't expected it to happen at 30,000 feet in the air, trapped in a cabin where there was no escape. Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat. "Sometimes people carry ugly things in their hearts, baby," she whispered, "and they try to pass that ugliness on to others." Amara frowned. "But I didn't do anything." "No, sweetheart, you didn't." Naomi squeezed her hand. "And you never will. But when people like that try to bring you down, you hold your head high. You don't let them win." Amara nodded, but the hurt was still there. The question still lingered in her small, innocent eyes. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning his gaze toward Meredith, who now stood at the front of the cabin, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could keep pushing, that no one would stop her. But Ethan wasn't about to let that happen, not on his watch. Naomi held Amara close, feeling the weight of her daughter's question still lingering in the air. The ache in her heart deepened. There was no simple way to explain why some people carried hatred in their hearts, why someone who was supposed to be professional, even kind, could be so cruel to a child. She wanted to believe the worst was over, that the cold stares and sharp words were the peak of Meredith's hostility. But Ethan Rivera knew better. From his seat a few rows back, his jaw was tight, his mind racing. He had spent years watching situations escalate, and every instinct in his body told him they weren't at the end of this confrontation. They were approaching its breaking point. Meredith stood at the front of the cabin, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. She didn't even attempt to hide it anymore. The disgust in her eyes, the barely restrained tension in her posture, it was clear that she was seething. Then Amara did something so small, so innocent, that no one could have expected what came next. The turbulence had finally settled, and the little girl turned her gaze back toward the window, staring out at the sky in wonder. She smiled, pressing her hands against the glass, and whispered, "Mommy, the clouds look like cotton candy again." Naomi smiled, rubbing her daughter's back gently. "They do, sweetheart." And for that brief moment, Amara forgot everything else, but Meredith did not. She turned abruptly, her whole body rigid with a fury that had been brewing since the start of the flight. In her mind, this child had been nothing but a disruption, an annoyance, something she wanted gone. Without thinking, without caring, she stormed back down the aisle, stopping right at Amara's row. Naomi barely had time to react before Meredith leaned down, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. "Didn't I tell you to be quiet?" she hissed. Amara flinched, shrinking into her seat. Naomi's eyes widened, her protective instincts flaring. "She wasn't being loud," Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. Meredith's glare snapped toward her. "Excuse me?" Naomi squared her shoulders. "My daughter wasn't bothering anyone." For a moment, Meredith just stood there, breathing heavily. The other passengers had begun to take notice, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then, in an act that stunned everyone, Meredith spat out a cruel, hateful remark, a slur so vile it seemed to freeze the entire cabin. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Amara's face fell, confusion and hurt flashing in her wide eyes. A shocked murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Ethan's body tensed, his hands curling into fists beneath the tray table. And then, before anyone could process it, Meredith's rage boiled over. She lifted her hand and struck Amara's small arm with a sharp, snapping motion. The slap echoed through the cabin. Amara let out a startled, pain-filled gasp, clutching her arm as tears welled in her eyes. For half a second, there was silence, a stunned, horrifying silence. Then chaos erupted. Naomi's instincts took over. She lunged forward, pulling Amara into her arms, her own voice trembling with rage and shock. "You do not touch my child!" Ethan was already out of his seat. His years of training kicked in as he moved with precision, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Step back, now." Meredith barely had time to turn before she felt Ethan's strong grip on her arm, his voice level but filled with an authority that sent a chill through her spine. "I'm a federal agent," he said, his badge flashing in his other hand. "And you just assaulted a minor." Gasps spread through the passengers. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Others called for help, their voices urgent. Meredith froze. Then, as if realizing the severity of what she had just done, she jerked her arm in an attempt to free herself. "You can't touch me," she shrieked. "This brat," Ethan didn't let her finish. "Sit down." His voice was iron, unwavering. "Right now." The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Meredith's face turned pale, her bravado flickering under the weight of her actions. Meanwhile, Naomi rocked Amara gently, whispering reassurances into her daughter's ear. The little girl's shoulders shook with silent sobs, her fingers clutching at Naomi's dress as if trying to disappear into her mother's arms. Passengers began to shout, "She hit a child! Get her off this plane!" "What kind of flight attendant does that?" Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Danielle, rushed forward, her face pale with horror. I'm so sorry," Danielle stammered. "I had no idea." "Get the pilot on the intercom," Ethan ordered, his grip still firm on Meredith. "This plane lands, and she's going straight to law enforcement." Danielle nodded quickly and rushed to the front of the cabin. Within moments, the pilot's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing due to a serious onboard incident. Please remain seated as we coordinate with authorities on the ground." The weight of those words settled over the entire plane. Meredith's breathing turned erratic. "You're ruining my career. You ruined it yourself," Ethan cut her off. "And you're lucky I don't put you in cuffs right now." He turned toward Naomi. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Naomi swallowed, holding Amara tighter. "She's scared." Her voice wavered with emotion. "But she's okay." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Meredith, his grip on her unrelenting. "Then let's make sure she gets justice." The tension inside the cabin was suffocating. Gasps and whispers rippled through the rows as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. The sight of a uniformed flight attendant striking a child, an act so unthinkable, so monstrous, had shaken everyone to their core. Naomi clutched Amara tightly against her chest, her heart pounding in her ears. She could still hear the sharp, hateful words Meredith had spat before the slap. Still see the way her daughter flinched in pain, the sheer disbelief in her big, innocent eyes. But she wasn't helpless. She wasn't going to let this stand. Ethan Rivera, his years of FBI training ingrained into his very being, kept his grip firm on Meredith's arm, his expression cold and unwavering. His voice carried the kind of weight that demanded immediate obedience. "You assaulted a child," he said, his voice even but edged with steel. "And you are going to answer for it." Meredith's eyes darted wildly around the cabin as if searching for an escape. You can't just," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her actions. "I was provoked," Ethan scoffed. "By an 8-year-old? Meredith's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Passengers began raising their voices in outrage. She hit that little girl. I got it all on video. She should be in cuffs. The younger flight attendant Danielle looked horrified as she pressed the intercom button to alert the pilot. The authorities have been notified, she said quickly, her voice shaking. They'll be waiting for us when we land. Meredith's face paled, and for the first time true fear flickered in her eyes. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only Meredith to hear. Do you understand the kind of trouble you're in? He asked. You attacked a minor. There are witnesses, video evidence, and I'm a federal agent. He let that last sentence sink in. You're done. Meredith's lips trembled. She let out a sharp breath, trying to wrench her arm away, but Ethan didn't budge. Sit down, he commanded. Meredith glared at him but obeyed, sinking stiffly into an empty aisle seat. Ethan kept his stance firm, his eyes locked on her, ensuring she wouldn't try anything else. The pilot's voice crackled through the overhead speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an onboard incident, we will be making an emergency landing. Law enforcement will be waiting at the gate. We ask that all passengers remain seated. Naomi barely heard the announcement. She was too focused on Amara, who had buried her face against her mother's chest, her small body trembling. Naomi cupped her daughter's cheeks, lifting her face gently. Baby, look at me, she whispered. Amara sniffled, her eyes red and watery. You did nothing wrong, Naomi assured her, her voice steady despite the rage boiling inside her. Do you hear me? Nothing. Amara nodded slowly, but the confusion and hurt in her eyes broke Naomi's heart. Danielle, still visibly shaken, knelt beside them. I am so sorry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know she was like this. I swear I didn't know. Naomi swallowed hard. She wasn't angry at Danielle. The young woman looked just as horrified as everyone else. Is your daughter okay? Danielle asked hesitantly. Naomi inhaled sharply. She needs ice for her arm. Danielle nodded quickly and rushed to the galley. Ethan watched the interaction closely. He had dealt with criminals for years, had witnessed acts of cruelty, of hatred, of violence, but something about this moment hit him differently. Maybe it was because Amara reminded him of his niece. Maybe it was because she had been nothing but kind and joyful. And yet, for no reason beyond sheer hatred, she had been a target. Or maybe it was because he had seen so many cases where prejudice escalated, where no one stepped in until it was too late. Not this time. As the plane began its descent, the hush over the cabin was thick with tension. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, shaking their heads, glancing toward Meredith with disgust. Some had already uploaded videos to social media. The news would spread quickly. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the flight attendants, excluding Meredith, immediately secured the cabin for arrival. The pilot wasted no time in his next announcement. Law enforcement will now be boarding the plane. Please remain in your seats. A murmur spread through the passengers. Then a shift, movement near the front. Ethan turned just as two uniformed police officers stepped onto the aircraft. Their eyes scanned the rows before settling on him. He stood tall. I'm Special Agent Ethan Rivera, FBI, he said, flashing his badge. This woman is your suspect. Meredith's head jerked toward him, her mouth opening in protest. But before she could utter a word, the officers moved in. Meredith Jameson? One of the officers asked. She swallowed hard, her fingers clenching the armrests. This is ridiculous. You are under arrest for assaulting a minor. Gasps rippled through the plane again, even though everyone had been expecting it. One officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Please stand up. Meredith whipped her head toward Ethan, eyes blazing with fury. You're really doing this? Ethan didn't blink. You did this to yourself. With a shaky breath, Meredith slowly stood, her entire body trembling with suppressed rage. But as the cuffs snapped around her wrists, something shifted in her expression. Panic. She turned toward Naomi and Amara, her face twisting into something ugly. This is all your fault, she spat. Ethan stepped between them before she could say another word. Enough. His voice was dangerously low. You're done talking. The officers wasted no time escorting her off the plane, her protests drowned out by the murmurs of passengers, some of whom had their phones raised, recording every moment. And just like that, she was gone. Naomi let out a long, shaky breath. The weight on her chest was still heavy, but at least now, it was over. Danielle returned moments later, pressing a small bag of ice gently into Amara's hands. Here, sweetheart. Amara mumbled a quiet, thank you, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan knelt beside her, his expression softer now. You were very brave, he told her. Do you know that? Amara hesitated, then nodded, still holding tightly onto her mother's sleeve. Ethan turned to Naomi. Do you have someone meeting you at the airport? Naomi nodded. My cousin. Good. He exhaled, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. The officers will need a statement from you, but I'll be around if you need anything. Naomi met his gaze. Thank you. Her voice wavered slightly. For stepping in. Ethan gave a small nod. It's what I do. But even as he said the words, he knew this moment meant more than just another case. Because sometimes, justice wasn't just about upholding the law. It was about standing up loudly, unapologetically for what was right. As the plane taxied toward the gate, a heavy silence filled the cabin. The weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air, thick with tension and disbelief. Passengers exchanged hushed whispers, their eyes shifting between Naomi, who was cradling Amara protectively, and the empty space where Meredith had been moments ago. Ethan Rivera remained standing, his eyes scanning the cabin as he ensured everything remained under control. He had been in high-stakes situations before, but this was different. This was personal. Amara, still nestled against her mother's chest, held onto her stuffed giraffe, Tully, like a lifeline. The little girl had stopped crying, but the pain and confusion in her expression were unmistakable. Her small fingers clutched Naomi's sleeve as if letting go would somehow make the nightmare real again. Naomi pressed a soft kiss to the top of her daughter's head, whispering, "You're safe now, sweetheart. Mommy's here." At the front of the aircraft, the flight crew hurriedly coordinated with airport security. The pilot's voice returned over the intercom, firm but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats until instructed otherwise. Law enforcement and medical personnel are waiting at the gate to assist." The moment the plane came to a full stop, the doors were unsealed. A group of uniformed officers, accompanied by paramedics, stepped onto the aircraft. Their presence was both reassuring and a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Ethan was the first to step forward, flashing his badge as he quickly debriefed the officers. "The suspect has already been taken into custody," he explained. "Multiple witnesses, video evidence. The victim is a minor, 8 years old. She needs immediate medical attention for a possible injury." One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and a soothing voice, knelt in front of Naomi and Amara. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said gently to Amara. "My name is Sophie. I'm here to help. Can I take a look at your arm?" Amara hesitated, her grip on Naomi tightening. Naomi stroked her daughter's back. "It's okay, baby. She just wants to make sure you're not hurt." Slowly, Amara loosened her grip, allowing the paramedic to examine her arm. Sophie unwrapped the small ice pack Danielle had given Amara earlier and gently touched the bruised skin. "It's tender," Sophie observed, her voice soft. "But it doesn't look like there's a fracture. That's good news." Naomi exhaled, some of the tension in her chest easing. "I'd still recommend having a doctor check it out," Sophie continued. "And if she feels any more pain later, don't hesitate to take her in." Naomi nodded, pulling Amara close again. "Thank you." Meanwhile, the officers moved through the cabin, speaking with witnesses. Many passengers eagerly stepped forward, eager to make statements. Several had already recorded the altercation, and they were more than willing to hand over their footage to ensure justice was served. One man, an older gentleman with silver hair and a serious expression, handed an officer his business card. "I'm an attorney," he said. "If the mother needs legal counsel, I'd be happy to assist." Naomi overheard, her throat tightening with emotion. She had prepared herself to handle this alone, but now it felt like people were rallying around her and Amara in a way she hadn't expected. Ethan approached her, his demeanor softer than before. "Naomi," he said, his voice steady but kind, "do you have someone meeting you at the airport?" Naomi nodded. "My cousin Simone. She should be waiting for us outside." Ethan gestured toward the open door. "I'll walk you both out." Naomi hesitated, glancing down at Amara, who still hadn't let go of her. The little girl's face was tired, her usual bright energy dimmed by everything that had happened. "Do you want to walk, sweetheart?" Naomi asked gently. Amara nodded hesitantly. Carefully, Naomi helped her stand, keeping an arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. As they made their way toward the exit, the passengers they passed murmured quiet words of support. Some smiled sympathetically, others nodded in encouragement. When they reached the jet bridge, the cool air of the airport terminal was a stark contrast to the stifling weight of the cabin. And then, there she was. Simone stood just beyond the security barrier, her arms folded, her expression tight with worry. The moment she spotted them, her eyes welled with emotion. "Naomi, Amara." Amara's eyes brightened just a little. "Auntie Simone," she whispered. Simone rushed forward, wrapping them both in a fierce, protective hug. "Oh, baby girl," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw what happened on the news. I came as fast as I could." Naomi buried her face in her cousin's shoulder, finally allowing herself to release a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan gave them a moment before stepping forward. "Miss Simone?" Simone pulled back, wiping at her eyes before turning to him. "Yes?" He extended a small notepad. I've written down my contact information. If you need any further assistance, whether legal advice, follow-ups with the authorities, or even just support, please reach out. Naomi took the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked up at Ethan, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, quietly, she said, "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to." He glanced down at Amara, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You just take care of her." Amara, still clutching Tully, looked up at him with big, solemn eyes. "You stopped her," she said softly. Ethan crouched slightly so he was at eye level with her. "Yeah," he said gently, "because no one should ever hurt you." Amara studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she reached out and wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but then slowly, he hugged her back. Naomi swallowed hard, feeling her eyes sting with tears. As they pulled away, Simone squeezed Naomi's arm. "Come on, let's get you both home." Ethan watched as they walked away. Amara's small frame still nestled against her mother's side. He took a deep breath, letting the tension in his shoulders finally ease. Justice had been served. But more than that, Amara was safe. And that was all that mattered. Naomi sat in the passenger seat of Simone's car, her hand resting on Amara's knee as they drove away from the airport. The little girl had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against Naomi's arm, her stuffed giraffe, Tully, still clutched tightly in her hands. Simone glanced over, her expression full of concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. Naomi exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep replaying it in my head, the way she looked at Amara, the way she hit her, and," she swallowed hard, "and how my baby asked me why she didn't like her." Simone's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I saw the videos, Naomi. The whole world is seeing them." And she wasn't exaggerating. By the time they reached Simone's house, Naomi's phone was flooded with messages. Some were from family and friends, offering their support and outrage over what had happened. Others were notifications, news articles, social media posts, videos spreading like wildfire. The footage of Meredith striking Amara had gone viral. It was on every major news outlet. Headlines ranged from flight attendant attacks child on plane to shocking act of racism caught on camera at 30,000 feet. The video clips were all over social media, racking up millions of views within hours. People were horrified, outraged. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people alike were condemning Meredith's actions, demanding justice. Naomi scrolled through the comments with a mix of emotions. "This is sickening. That woman should never work in customer service again. That poor little girl, my heart breaks for her. Arrest isn't enough. She needs to be charged with a hate crime. Who's the mother? Let's make sure they have legal support." Naomi's hands trembled as she put the phone down. It was overwhelming. Simone sat beside her, rubbing her back. "You don't have to read all that right now. Focus on Amara." Naomi nodded, glancing at her sleeping daughter. But even as she tried to focus on the moment, the world outside was moving fast. By the next morning, Meredith's face was everywhere. News stations aired segments analyzing her behavior, replaying her aggressive actions on a loop. Her employer, the airline, had no choice but to respond. Within hours of the footage going viral, they released an official statement. "We are aware of the deeply disturbing incident that took place on Flight 472. The flight attendant in question has been terminated effective immediately. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination or violence, and we are fully cooperating with authorities in their investigation." It wasn't enough to stop the backlash. Protests erupted outside the airline's corporate offices, with demonstrators holding signs reading, "Justice for Amara" and "End Racism in the Skies." Meredith's name and photo were everywhere. Reporters dug into her past, unearthing old complaints from passengers who had experienced similar, though less extreme, hostility. Several former co-workers came forward, admitting that Meredith had a reputation for being cold and selective in how she treated certain passengers. One former flight attendant, speaking anonymously, told a journalist, "I wasn't surprised when I saw the video. She always had this attitude, like she thought certain passengers didn't belong." Then came the legal consequences. Meredith was formally charged with assaulting a minor, a serious offense on its own. But public pressure led prosecutors to consider hate crime enhancements, arguing that her attack had been fueled by racial bias. Sitting in Simone's living room, Naomi watched the news unfold in real time. Footage of Meredith, now in an orange jumpsuit, being led into court filled the screen. Her once neatly pinned blonde hair was disheveled, her sharp blue eyes no longer filled with arrogance, but with something else entirely, fear. Her lawyer spoke to reporters outside the courthouse claiming, "Ms. Jameson was under extreme stress and deeply regrets her actions." The reporters weren't buying it, neither was Naomi. She turned off the TV, rubbing her temples. "Stress doesn't make you hit a child," she muttered. Simone nodded firmly. She thought she could get away with it, but she was wrong. Despite the chaos unfolding in the outside world, Naomi's priority remained the same, Amara. The little girl was quiet, more subdued than usual. She still smiled when Naomi or Simone made silly faces, still reached for her mother's hand when she needed comfort. But there was a hesitancy now, a lingering shadow in her bright eyes. One evening, Naomi found her sitting by the window, hugging Tully tightly. "What's on your mind, baby?" she asked gently, sitting beside her. Amara hesitated before whispering, "Is she going to come back?" Naomi's heart clenched. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "She's never going to hurt you again." Amara nodded, but she didn't seem entirely convinced. After a moment, she whispered, "She was really mad at me." Naomi swallowed hard, pulling her daughter into her lap. "She was mad because she has hate in her heart, not because you did anything wrong." Amara looked up. "Then why did she hit me?" Naomi exhaled slowly, stroking her daughter's braids. "Because some people, when they feel hate, they want to hurt others. But listen to me, her hate is not your burden. You don't have to carry it." Amara was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she whispered, "Okay." Naomi kissed the top of her head, holding her close. It would take time. Healing always did. But she knew one thing for certain, Amara was strong. And she would never have to face this alone. As the days passed, more legal proceedings loomed. Ethan remained in touch, offering updates, ensuring that Naomi and Amara had the support they needed. The attorney who had reached out at the airport officially took on their case, promising to pursue legal action not just against Meredith, but possibly against the airline for allowing her to remain employed despite past complaints. Meanwhile, people around the country continued rallying around Amara. Letters, gifts, and messages of support poured in. Parents sent notes saying they had used Amara's story to teach their children about courage and kindness. Teachers reached out, wanting to ensure their classrooms were safe and inclusive spaces. And through it all, Naomi reminded her daughter, "You are loved. You are important, and no one can take that away from you." The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Naomi knew one thing, justice was already in motion. And this time, the world was watching. The days following the flight felt like a blur for Naomi. Though Meredith was behind bars, and the world had rallied around them, she knew that justice alone couldn't erase the emotional scars left behind. Amara was different now. She still smiled, still played with her stuffed giraffe, Tully, but something had changed. It was in the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she clung a little tighter to Naomi whenever they were in a public place. At night, Naomi would check on her daughter, only to find Amara curled up in bed, her little body tense even in sleep. Some nights, she would wake up crying, her small voice trembling as she called out for her mother. Naomi would rush to her side, holding her close, whispering reassurances. "It's okay, baby, you're safe. I've got you." But each time Amara would whisper the same question, her voice barely above a breath. "Why did she hate me, Mommy?" Naomi's heart shattered every time she heard those words. How could she explain something so ugly to someone so pure? One afternoon, as they sat in Simone's cozy living room, Naomi noticed Amara sitting by the window, staring outside but not really looking at anything. She walked over, kneeling beside her. "Sweetheart, do you want to go outside and play?" Amara shook her head. Naomi brushed a hand over her daughter's curls. "Do you want to color? We could draw more giraffes." Another shake of the head. "Okay," Naomi said softly, sitting beside her. "Do you want to talk?" Amara was silent for a long moment before she finally said, "I don't want to go on a plane again." Naomi's heart clenched. She had been expecting this, but hearing it still hurt. "You don't have to, sweetheart," she said. "Not until you're ready." Amara nodded but didn't say anything else. That evening, Naomi made a quiet phone call. Ethan Rivera had stayed in contact, checking in on them when he could. When Naomi called, his voice was calm and steady, just as it had been on the plane. "She's struggling," Naomi admitted. "I don't know how to help her." Ethan listened carefully before speaking. "Have you considered therapy?" "I have," Naomi said, "but I don't even know where to start." "I do," Ethan replied. "I have some connections, people who specialize in trauma counseling for kids. I can help set something up." Naomi exhaled in relief. "Thank you." The next day, Ethan followed through on his word. He connected Naomi with a therapist who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. At first, Amara was hesitant. The idea of talking to a stranger about what happened made her nervous. But after a few sessions, she started opening up slowly, carefully. The therapist used drawing exercises to help Amara express her feelings. At first, her pictures were filled with stormy clouds and airplanes with dark shadows. But over time, she started adding the sun, little birds, and her favorite, giraffes, still flying through the sky. One day, she showed Naomi a drawing of herself sitting on a plane again, this time with kind flight attendants smiling around her. Naomi felt tears well in her eyes. Does this mean you think you'll be ready to fly again one day? Amara hesitated before giving a small nod. Maybe, if you're with me. Naomi pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Always, baby, always. Though the healing process was slow, Naomi started to see glimpses of her old Amara again. She laughed a little more. She played with her cousins. She asked questions about the world again, her natural curiosity shining through. But some scars took longer to fade. One afternoon, they went to the grocery store. A flight attendant in uniform walked past them, and Naomi immediately felt Amara's small hand tighten around hers. She looked down and saw the fear flash in her daughter's eyes. Naomi knelt beside her, holding her close. "That's not her, sweetheart," she whispered. "She's not Meredith." Amara swallowed, still clutching her mother's hand. "But what if she's mean too?" Naomi took a deep breath. "There are good people in the world, Amara. People like Mr. Ethan, people like the nice flight attendant who helped us. Not everyone is like her." Amara looked up at her, as if weighing those words. Then slowly, she nodded. It would take time. But Naomi knew her daughter would get there, and when she did, Naomi would be right there beside her, just as she always had been. The day had finally arrived. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as people took their seats, the air heavy with anticipation. The case had drawn national attention. News cameras lined the courthouse steps, journalists eagerly waiting for updates. The world had not forgotten what happened to Amara. Naomi sat in the front row, her hand tightly wrapped around Amara's. She could feel her daughter's small fingers clutching her own, seeking reassurance. Amara wasn't required to testify in court. The prosecution had made sure of that, using video evidence and witness statements instead. But she still wanted to be here. "I want to see what happens," Amara had whispered that morning, and Naomi understood. Seated a few rows back was Ethan Rivera. He had been called as a key witness, but even if he hadn't, he wouldn't have missed this for anything. At the defense table, Meredith Jamison sat stiffly in her chair, her once pristine appearance replaced with a tired, defeated look. Gone was the crisp flight attendant uniform, replaced by a dull gray suit. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely responded. She knew what was coming. The trial had moved quickly. The prosecution had an airtight case, video footage, multiple eyewitness accounts, and the undeniable fact that Meredith had struck a child in front of an entire plane full of people. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Hayes, wasted no time painting a clear picture of what had happened. This was not a case of an overworked employee losing patience, Hayes told the jury. This was a deliberate act of aggression fueled by prejudice. Ms. Jamison didn't just lose her temper, she targeted an innocent child, and she did so with malice. Naomi squeezed Amara's hand as the courtroom watched the video footage again, the moment Meredith snapped. The cruel words, the slap that had left Amara trembling in pain. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even though many had already seen the footage, watching it play out in a courtroom setting made it all the more real. Ethan took the stand next. He sat tall, his expression firm and unwavering as he recounted everything he had witnessed that day. The subtle hostility that escalated, the deliberate cruelty, and finally the moment he had no choice but to intervene. "I've worked in law enforcement for years," he told the jury. "I've seen prejudice manifest in different ways. What I saw that day was calculated. It was not just an impulsive action. It was a person who let hatred guide their choices." The defense attempted to push back. Meredith's lawyer argued that she had been under extreme stress, that she had simply snapped due to fatigue and pressure. But the jury wasn't buying it. The video footage, the witness testimonies, the airline's own records of previous complaints against Meredith, all of it painted a damning picture. And then, there was Meredith herself. When she took the stand, her attempt at appearing remorseful was hollow. She tried to claim that she hadn't meant to hurt Amara, that she had simply been frustrated. "I was exhausted," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake." The prosecutor was relentless. "A mistake?" Hayes pressed. "You didn't just make a mistake, Miss Jamison. You struck an 8-year-old child." Meredith faltered. I wasn't thinking clearly." "Or," Hayes continued, her voice cold, "you were thinking exactly as you always do, only this time you didn't get away with it." Meredith's face paled. The final blow came when a legal expert was brought in to discuss hate crime enhancements. Given the overwhelming evidence that Meredith had targeted Amara specifically because of her race, the judge ruled that this was more than just assault. It was racially motivated violence. That changed everything. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before reaching a unanimous decision. When they returned to the courtroom, silence fell over the room as the judge prepared to read the verdict. On the charge of assaulting a minor, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racially motivated harassment, we find the defendant guilty. The final charge carried the weight of a hate crime enhancement, ensuring a harsher sentence. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by hushed whispers. Meredith's face drained of color as reality settled in. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, her breathing coming in short, panicked bursts. Then came the sentencing. The judge's voice was firm, unwavering. Ms. Jameson, your actions were heinous, unjustified, and deeply damaging, not only to the victim, but to the principles of human decency. Your position as a flight attendant put you in a role of responsibility, yet you abused that role to carry out an act of violence against a child. This court will not tolerate such behavior. A pause, then the final decision. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in prison. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Naomi exhaled, a breath she felt like she had been holding for months. Meredith's eyes widened in horror. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, 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 the judge ignored her outburst. You will be eligible for parole after serving 8 years, depending on behavior. However, this court strongly recommends that you undergo rehabilitation and bias intervention programs before any such consideration is made. Meredith's head dropped, her entire body slumping as reality set in. She was going to prison. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi turned to Amara. The little girl sat still, processing everything. She had just watched the woman who had hurt her be taken away, punished for what she had done. Are you okay, baby? Naomi asked softly. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then finally she nodded. She can't hurt me anymore, she whispered. No, sweetheart, Naomi said, pulling her close. She never will again. As they stepped outside, the afternoon sun was warm against their skin. Reporters called out to Naomi, but she ignored them, focusing only on Amara. Ethan caught up to them. You did good in there, he told Naomi. She gave a small, tired smile. I just wanted justice for my daughter. Ethan nodded. And you got it. Amara looked up at him, her small voice hesitant but certain. Thank you for helping us. Ethan crouched down so they were at eye level. You're strong, Amara, he said. Stronger than you know. The little girl nodded, and for the first time in weeks she smiled. A real, bright Amara smile. And as Naomi led her daughter away, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just the end of a painful chapter. It was the beginning of healing, of reclaiming joy. And finally, for the first time in a long time, Amara was free. The weeks following the trial felt lighter. The weight that had pressed down on Naomi's chest for so long had finally begun to ease. Justice had been served. Meredith was gone. The world had seen the truth, and more importantly, Amara knew that she was safe. But healing was not immediate. Naomi watched her daughter closely, noticing the small changes in her. Amara smiled more often now, but there was still a hesitancy in her laughter, as if she was waiting for something bad to happen. She no longer woke up crying at night, but she still held Tully, her beloved stuffed giraffe, tight when she slept, as if the world might take it from her. She had been brave, so incredibly brave. But Naomi knew that her baby girl deserved more than just survival. She deserved to live freely, to be happy again. One morning, Naomi found Amara sitting at the kitchen table, drawing. At first, she felt relief. Her daughter had always loved coloring, and seeing her with her crayons again was a small victory. But then she noticed what Amara was drawing. It was a picture of a little girl on an airplane, but instead of looking happy, the girl had tears streaming down her face. The flight attendants in the drawing were frowning, looming over her like shadows. Naomi's heart ached. She sat beside Amara, brushing a gentle hand over her daughter's back. What are you thinking about, sweetheart? Amara hesitated, her crayon hovering over the paper. I don't know, she whispered. I guess. I still think about her sometimes. Naomi nodded, choosing her words carefully. That's okay, baby. What happened was scary. It's normal to think about it. Amara looked up at her mother, her dark eyes searching. Do you think she's still mad at me? Naomi's breath hitched. She cupped Amara's face gently. Oh, sweetheart. She was never mad at you. She was mad at the world, at something inside herself. It had nothing to do with you. Amara stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Naomi kissed her forehead. Would you like to draw something else? Amara hesitated, then pushed the picture aside and grabbed a new sheet of paper. This time she drew herself on an airplane again, but this time the sky was bright and the flight attendants were smiling. And she was smiling too. One day, while walking through the park, Amara suddenly stopped near a playground full of children. Naomi turned to her. Do you want to play? Amara looked uncertain. I don't know. Naomi knelt beside her, holding her hand. You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you do, I'll be right here watching. Amara bit her lip, looking at the kids laughing on the swings and climbing the jungle gym. Then, after a deep breath, she nodded. I want to try. Naomi smiled. Okay, baby. She watched as Amara slowly walked toward the other kids. At first, she stood on the edge, uncertain. But then, a little girl in a yellow dress waved at her. Do you want to go down the slide with me? The girl asked. Amara hesitated, then, to Naomi's relief, she nodded. As she climbed up the slide, Naomi wiped a tear from her cheek. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. A few days later, Naomi got a text from Ethan Rivera. Ethan, hey, just checking in. How's Amara doing? Naomi smiled before replying. Naomi, better. She's taking small steps, but she's healing. Ethan, that's good to hear. Let me know if she ever wants to talk. Naomi paused, then typed something else. Naomi, actually, would you want to visit? I think it might help her to see you again. Ethan's response was immediate. Ethan, I'd love to. When Ethan arrived at Simone's house later that week, Amara peeked at him from behind Naomi's leg. Ethan crouched to her level, smiling gently. Hey there, kiddo. Amara hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a hug. Ethan blinked in surprise, then hugged her back. Naomi felt tears prick at her eyes again. Amara looked up at him. I'm getting braver, she said softly. Ethan smiled. I never doubted it. One afternoon, as Naomi and Amara sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Amara turned to her mother with a thoughtful expression. Mommy? Yes, sweetheart? Do you think I'll ever go on a plane again? Naomi felt her breath catch. She had been waiting for this question. She turned to her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. I think one day when you're ready, you will. Amara was quiet for a moment, then slowly she nodded. I think I want to try, she whispered. Naomi smiled, holding her daughter's hand. And in that moment she knew Amara wasn't just surviving anymore. She was finding her way back to joy. Years passed, and Amara grew into a confident, determined young woman. The shy little girl who had once clutched her stuffed giraffe, Tully, for comfort had transformed into someone with a fire in her heart, someone who refused to let her past define her. She still remembered that flight. She still remembered the fear. She still remembered the way Meredith had looked at her, the way her words had stung even before her hand had struck. But more importantly, she remembered something else. She remembered how her mother had held her tight, whispering that she was safe. She remembered how Officer Ethan had stepped in, standing up for her when no one else had. She remembered the way people had rallied behind her, strangers offering love and support, reminding her that she was not alone. And she carried those memories, not as wounds, but as fuel. By the time Amara was in high school, she had learned to channel her experience into something meaningful. She started volunteering with younger kids, helping those who had been bullied or felt out of place. She visited community centers, speaking to children about standing up for themselves, about finding their voices even when the world tried to silence them. One day, she was invited to speak at an elementary school's anti-bullying assembly. As she stood on the small stage, looking out at dozens of young faces, she took a deep breath. My name is Amara Daniels, she began, her voice strong. When I was 8 years old, something happened to me that I didn't understand. Someone hurt me, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. And for a long time, I was scared. I thought maybe the world wasn't safe for me. The room was silent. She looked down at the small, bright-eyed kids watching her, and her heart ached. But I learned something important, she continued. I learned that for every person who wants to tear you down, there are so many more who will lift you up. I learned that my voice matters, and so does yours. A little girl in the front row raised her hand timidly. Were you scared? Amara smiled gently. Yes, but being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you have something to fight for. By the time she finished speaking, the entire room erupted into applause. And as she stepped off the stage, Naomi, who had been watching from the back of the auditorium, felt tears slip down her cheeks. Her baby girl wasn't just healing, she was thriving. One day during her senior year, Amara received a message she hadn't expected. Ethan Rivera, heard you're doing big things. You've come a long way, kid. Amara smiled as she read the text. She hadn't seen Ethan in years, but he had always kept in touch, checking in from time to time. Amara, you were right. I was strong enough. Ethan, I never doubted it. A few days later, they met at a small cafe near the police station where Ethan now worked as a lead investigator. The moment Amara walked in, Ethan stood up, his expression filled with pride. You've grown up, he said with a chuckle. Amara grinned. That tends to happen. As they sat down, Ethan leaned forward slightly. So, what's next for you? Amara hesitated, then took a deep breath. I want to study law. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Law? She nodded. I want to help people the way you helped me. I want to make sure that kids like me don't have to feel powerless. Ethan studied her for a moment, then smiled. "You're going to do great things, Amara." She felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I hope so." Years later, Amara stood in front of an audience once again, this time at her college graduation. She had worked harder than she ever thought possible, dedicating herself to justice, to making sure that what had happened to her would never happen to another child. As she stepped onto the stage to accept her diploma, she caught sight of her mother, tears of pride in her eyes. Beside her, Simone cheered loudly, and further back, Ethan gave her a proud nod. Amara took the diploma in her hands, gripping it tightly. She had turned her pain into purpose. She had taken something that could have broken her and built herself into something stronger. And as she walked off the stage, she knew, without a doubt, her story was just beginning. Life is not always fair. Sometimes, we or our loved ones face injustice, discrimination, or even violence. But what truly matters is not just what happens to us, it's how we rise after those challenges. Amara's story is more than just a tragedy. It is a testament to the power of justice, resilience, and compassion. One of the greatest lessons from this story is the importance of standing up for what is right. If Special Agent Ethan Rivera had chosen to look away instead of stepping in, who knows how much worse things could have been. In life, we often witness wrongdoing but hesitate to speak up. However, we must remember that silence can enable injustice, and even the smallest action can change someone's life. Another powerful lesson is the strength of community and kindness. When Amara and her mother faced discrimination, they were not alone. People spoke out, witnesses came forward, and justice was served. This reminds us that we are stronger together. When we see someone suffering injustice, whether it's a child, an elderly person, or anyone in need, we can be the difference. A kind word, a supportive action, or a brave stand can turn the tide. Most importantly, Amara's story teaches us the power of resilience, turning pain into purpose. Instead of letting hatred break her, she chose to rise, to help others, and to use her painful experience as motivation for change. In life, we all face struggles, losses, and hardships, but we can decide how we respond. So, the real question is, what can we do to create a more just and compassionate world? Stand up when you see injustice. Don't be afraid to speak out, whether it's defending someone in need or standing up for fairness. Embrace kindness. Small acts of compassion can make a big difference. A smile, a word of encouragement, or a helping hand can change a life. Be strong in the face of adversity. Life will challenge us, but we must not let our struggles define us. Instead, let them shape us into stronger, wiser, and more compassionate individuals. If this story touched your heart, share it with others. Let's build a community that not only stands against injustice, but also spreads love and resilience. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to hear more powerful stories. Together, we can make a difference.